one of the first people that I connected with, heard about when I moved here about 11 years ago, and about the time that Local to Global was getting started. And I heard then about his work to save a mountain, his work against the urban camping laws, and in solidarity with homeless people, people who are houseless. And he is just active on every front, from growing his own food to walking the talk, and is not coincidentally, there are people from Justice Studies present, so I better say he's an alum, got his doctorate in Justice Studies here at ASU, also is a JD, also I guess was a basketball star, and that's what he told me to say.
Swam the English Channel, there's more.
Swam the English Channel. What else was it?
Captain of the high school gymnastics.
There we go. There we go. He's going to do a backflip as an encore if you give him a lot of applause at the end. Help me welcome Randall.
It's always good to be here. And I just want to honor the folks who help put this on every year. It seems effortless, and that's a testament to how well they've evolved this model. A lot of times what we do as activists is in fact creating a container, and then we're letting others fill it, and sometimes organically and dynamically so, having to deal with all the variables that come with that. So I just want to take a moment to honor the folks. You can see them with the Local to Global Justice shirts on. But let's just have a round of applause for the people that helped us. So I want to talk a little bit about a concept that I think of as a radical concept. But of course, as my friend and mentor Pat Lauderdale once taught me, sometimes the word radical is unnecessary. It's kind of embedded in the notion. Empathy, as a working concept, if we actually put it into practice in our lives, would be among the most radical things we could do in this world. And we may not often think of it that way, because empathy sounds, kind of naive, or it's very sweet, or it's nice to be empathetic, but it doesn't necessarily connote radicalism. But in fact, I'd like to suggest to you that if we did take it and operationalize it in our lives and our work, it might be just the key not only to helping to change the world, but also toward meeting the goals for what we're here to do this weekend, which is to promote a dialogue toward healing and renewal. We need some of that. Sometimes we tend to skip that step, especially as people who care about the larger issues in the world. We sometimes deny ourselves care and healing in the process. Think of the irony. We're out to save the world, but we don't work on saving ourselves. That seems a little backwards sometimes, but that's part of the choice that we make. So the double meaning of radical empathy is that A, the concept is radical, but I would also like to suggest that we think a little bit about having empathy for the radical. If we can have sympathy for the devil, we can certainly have empathy for the radical. I think it's only fair. Maybe there's a song in there somewhere for anybody who's ambitious, empathy for the radical. So here's a starting point, just to get us into thinking about the topic. First of all, radical empathy potentially includes some of the most cutting-edge theories of the human capacity for compassion. This isn't just speculation or wishful thinking. Science is actually beginning to catch up and prove that there are actually empirical and rational bases for understanding empathy as a big part of the human equation. It's always interesting that science seems to lag behind common sense by a few centuries. Things that we've accepted as fundamental truths, I mean we in the big picture of humankind, for eons, eventually science comes around and proves them. All of the indigenous cosmologies turned out to be right, according to the quantum theorists. They finally figured it out like thousands of years later. Well, empathy is in that same category, that it's the cutting edge of science, and yet it's something that's been with us since the beginning. It also includes something along the lines of thinking about ethics in a different way. Ethics as a function of relationships, rather than a static endpoint that we aim for, or some objective criteria from which to measure our actions and activities. Ethics is something to be constantly negotiated in our relationships with each other, often and ourselves, oftentimes around the concept of care, and how we express caring and compassionate and loving intentions toward ourselves, our communities, and the world itself. At the end of the day, those things aren't all that separate, after all. The capacity to manifest compassion or love toward anything is emblematic of our capacity to do so toward the whole as well. And then there's another piece in here. I've got the kind of bullet points highlighted in red for you. The notion that we oftentimes in this culture tend to individualize and privatize our struggles and challenges. So for many of us, especially those of us who are actively engaged with the struggles and challenges in our midst, we tend to think of our own pursuits as being the ones that we have to bear more silently. We're more reluctant to share our own stories than we are to work on behalf of somebody else. It's easier to locate oppression in something external to ourselves and be dedicated and passionate and eloquent about that. But when it comes to actually opening up our own pursuits and our own stories, it creates much more vulnerability. We tend to bear that more silently, more quietly. We've individualized our burdens as if we're separate human beings to some extent, which tends to create less capacity to work in concert, to engage these issues at all levels, from the personal up to the global. So part of the work that needs to be done for healing and renewal is to socialize our burdens. We don't just want to take the benefits in society and distribute them more fairly, but the burdens as well. It's two sides to the same coin. So those are some of the big picture things we're going to talk about. Excuse me. And we're not the only ones doing this work right now. Actually, if you look around a number of activist communities, these issues of how to deal with burnout, persecution, frustration, feelings of futility, these are pretty prevalent across a wide range of activist communities. So I adapted a few of these bullet points from a workshop that was done at Occupy Memphis. But this is just one of many. This is kind of the common thread right now, especially as we realize that after all the years we've been working on social justice and environmental issues, in some ways you can make the argument that things have actually gotten worse. Just objectively speaking. We seem to be sliding further downhill instead of, upholding these kinds of rights and issues that we care so deeply about. How can that be the case? And if that's true, that we can pass the torch from political parties back and forth and nothing seems to change, in some ways, like I said, the tide seems to be turning in the wrong direction, you can see the psychological implications for those of us who are engaged with these issues. It leads to feelings of futility, a sense of burnout, ineffectiveness. But I would submit to you that there is no act of resistance that's ineffective. Every single act that we take to try to make this the world that we would like to live in, rather than the one that's imposed upon us, is a radical act, is a hopeful act, and is an effective act. Every single one. It's just hard to see that sometimes, because the big picture, the news of the day, constantly bombards us with a sense that what we do doesn't really matter all that much. Things are going to slide inexorably towards some predetermined, inevitable outcome, which is probably not going to be good. We know the story of civilization, the kind of Judeo-Christian theological version, the metaphorical Titanic version. It's we're on a collision course with our own hubris, and there's not much to be done about it. That's the standard operating narrative. But for me, in many ways, that's exactly the point where resistance comes in, and where our renewal comes in, is to resist that sense that it's all been written already. If that was the case, then really, why are we even still bothering to gather? Why are we talking? I feel like as long as there's still that window of opportunity open, the final chapters aren't written. It may be the case that everything we've done up to this point has been completely ineffective, except in one small way. It's kept the window of opportunity from being slammed shut altogether. That's a lot. It doesn't sound like a lot. If I said to you, wow, you've been so successful as an activist, you have incrementally slowed the rate of destruction. Good job. You're like, okay, let's have a party. That's great. But you know what? In some ways, that's everything. Because without all of that, without all the struggles of people before us, on whose shoulders we stand, without all the work that we do in the present, that we've done in the past, that we will do in the future, maybe the point is moot. We're not there, though. We still have that window of opportunity. And that's a real point to motivate and mobilize us as we think about what we project onto the next generations. So, we're going to explore a couple of the issues here. I want to put this in a context that's both personal and interpersonal. So here are some of the things, the common issues that activists often struggle with. The things that I see, and I'm willing to own this in myself, that I see in me when I look in the mirror and think about, am I doing what I need to be doing in this world? And by the way, let me just preface this by saying that I don't present something on radical empathy as if I figured it out or it's some finally evolved concept for me. This is being negotiated in real time. This is the kind of work that I see as being extremely important. When I hit the resonance frequency of it and I can see it happening, I see the power of it, but it's elusive. It takes a lot of time and a lot of forethought and a lot of practice to get it right because we're not well trained in these kinds of skills. But here are some of the pitfalls that I can identify, and I see the mirror very clearly when I put these up here. So this is about me as much as it's potentially about you. First of all, we have reactivism. So much of what we do is conditioned by what's happening outside of us. We're always reacting to the next atrocity, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one. We're playing defense almost all the time. And there's a lot of good reason to do that. Let's face it, I listed some down here. We're responding to crises. We're confronting injustice, interrupting oppression. These are really important things to do. And yet they don't often give us the opportunity to step back and say, well, what about the positive side? You know, where's the capacity to imagine a different future rather than always responding to the one that's being marketed at us or being imposed upon us? So this is a real issue for us, is being reactive rather than having the capacity to go beyond that. Next is lactivism. How often do we hear this in our circles? I feel like we're not really making a difference. We're losing the issue. Oh, you know, at the end of the day, you just can't fight City Hall. These kinds of fatalistic expressions. I feel like I'm not doing enough. If only I had done more, something would have turned out different. So we have this sense that even if we have victories, we tend to marginalize our own wins, our own, positive results by saying, well, but there's the larger issue. There's so many oppressions. They're all interconnected. The global nature of these things is so monumental. How do I get my mind around all that? Sure, we saved one patch of green space here, or we protected one group of vulnerable people, or we helped empower one community, but there's such a vast world, there's so many issues. You can spin this over and over again in your mind and kind of put yourself into a corner where nothing seems to be effective, that we're just not doing enough. There's too much on our plates, there's, too much to do, too little time, and again, it leads us to these expressions of potential futility. So here's the other side of it, which is that we want to do something. So sometimes we do clicktivism, sometimes known as slacktivism. Right? This is the one where you get to sit in your comfortable sofa and feel like you're doing good because you click on a banner, or you click a like button, or you set up a Facebook page, or you email around links. I mean, how often do activists, especially those of us tending toward the left side of the spectrum, we associate our activism with forwarding links to our friends. Wow, I did a lot today. I got a thing posted on a website, and I got this, thing connected where people looked at it, and I could see the number rose up, and there's 100 Facebook likes, and you can see that it becomes a thing. But in some ways, it's kind of a mile wide and an inch deep, right? It does reach people. We know that, and we don't have to abandon the technologies. It's not a critique of the technologies. We have to make of these things what we will. But sometimes it becomes easy to fool ourselves into thinking that we're being effective because, after all, there's a lot of feelings of futility and the challenges that I just mentioned. So, of course, it makes sense that we would see that Facebook like meter rising and think, wow, we're making a difference here. Whether or not that leads to action in the world, we don't necessarily connect those dots. We don't even know if it does in a lot of cases. We know that we created something that has a self-referential quality. It maybe discharges some feelings of our own guilt. It makes us feel productive. We can see a numerical outcome to it in many cases. I mobilized 100,000 people to care about Darfur. Okay, great, but what did they do? What happened in Darfur? Did the conditions change? Did it get to the root causes? So again, these are like ways that they might be more palliative than realistic. But to some extent, they're a challenge of activism because they kind of tempt us into thinking that we've done something useful, and maybe it even becomes kind of an obsession, where we're putting more and more of our eggs in that basket and losing a little bit of the texture of our human communities that I would submit makes us more effective as activists. I like to think of it this way: if your house was on fire, would you call your Facebook friends or your actual friends who live near you, who can come and help you and do something? Right? Your Facebook friends are great, but it only goes so far. It does not replace the face-to-face work that we need to do in the world. And then finally, this is the last of the negative ones, and I'll move on to the positive ones. Am I deepening your despair yet? That's part of my job as an empathetic activist.
That's like
Cracktivism. Right? I mean, you can almost get addicted to it, and if you think about the irony here, is that you need a constant streamline, it needs to be mainlining crisis, mainlining oppression. We need more injustice in the world, damn it, otherwise I'll have nothing to do. So I have more to do, I can't stop now. I'll take care of my needs later. It's just more important that I'm attached to these larger issues. My life may be falling apart, but the work is going really well. You know, classic signs of addiction, right? These are things that people say in a lot of other contexts. You get that buzz and the sense of release, and you need new challenges to fill the void. Sometimes it can obscure the reasons why we do things in the first place. We just get kind of addicted to being the outsider, being the righteous crusader, being the maverick, the lone voice of reason in our circles, the one at the Thanksgiving table who takes on the conservative family members and sets them straight. We wear these as badges of honor. We kind of self-martyr in some ways. There's good reasons for all this. Again, you know, I'm looking at you, but I'm thinking about myself as I'm saying all this. I've worn all these hats, right? And you go through cycles where one ebbs and one flows, and you're sort of, you know, moving between these different forms of potential activist burnout. So, here are some solutions, at least moving toward potential solutions. And you can read the slide right there. Activism is the rent I pay for living on this planet. We have to be activists. It's not really a choice. Every single one of us has to be active in creating the world that we live in. It's not a passive act. Reality is not a spectator sport. It's a participant sport. We're part of creating it. We're not just consumers of this reality, we're its co-creators. And that's an awesome burden, but it's also a sense of opportunity. So here are some ways to lessen the impact of some of the harsh realities that I was talking about just before. Contactivism. Reclaiming the human dimension in our work. Never letting it become so impersonal that we lose that texture of being in proximity. As I said to some folks a couple of months ago, there won't be a pheromone-free revolution in our time. We need to be connected to each other. The simple acts, the breaking of bread, the telling of stories, the shaking of hands, the hugging, the building of trust, that's important. We can't skip those pieces. And in fact, not only can we not skip them at the expense of the efficacy of our work, but we can't skip them for our own selves. We need that input. We need those reality checks. We need to be present and front and center for the communities that we are connected to. So reclaiming that, sharing those face-to-face moments, building relationships. In some ways, it all comes down to relationships. It's the basis of empathy, it's the basis of action, and it's actually an expression of the nature of the cosmos itself. Nothing is static. Everything exists in relationships. Reclaiming that is a way to be part of something larger and also nourish our own selves at the same time. Impactivism. Just a little reminder that you are doing good work in the world, you're making a difference, your work matters, and by the way, we can also celebrate our successes every now and then without having every moment of saying, wow, we did a good thing, also be like, yeah, but we've got another 1,000 things to work on. That's true. But sometimes we can just pause on the good things we've done and celebrate the fact that we're here and we're still having these conversations, we're evolving them over time. I see things like local to global as a big part of that. This is basically a decade-long evolving think tank. The players change, the names change, the issues evolve, but we're working on something here. And this is just one container of many. Find those moments, whether it's small circles, larger ones, or even global networks, that allow us to celebrate the positive impact we're making without, kind of resting on our laurels. We still have to get up the next day and roll up our sleeves. But in the meantime, we can focus on some of the things we've done right. And then begin to export those models. Wow, I heard about these people who had a campaign that they launched to save a public place or to work in a community or, set up restorative justice circles. How did they do that? Get in contact, find out what worked. Use the model, adapt it to your own local place. Look for successes and multiply those rather than the reaction to the crises that we're often caught up in. And, taking it moment by moment, day by day. Not always feeling like the pressure of all of human history is on our shoulders. Things didn't get to be this way overnight, and we're not going to fix them overnight. It's going to take a long time. In fact, many of the issues that we care deeply about won't be resolved in our lifetimes. These issues will be constantly engaged. In fact, in a healthy society, they should be constantly engaged by the people that are living in that time and place. For us, our task is maybe to bear the part we can bear as we're here, evolve it, try to turn the paradigm in a positive way, contribute as much as we can, leave the next generation with the tools and the capacity and the window of opportunity to continue the work. That's not so bad. Being part of a long, unbroken chain of people who care about things feels pretty good, actually, to me in some ways. So never giving up hope, knowing that at the end of the day, we will get this right. We will get this right. Humankind is, an evolving creation. We're kind of in our, maturation years. We're teenagers who have found the lighter in our parents' drawer, The question is, are we going to incinerate everything around us, or will we learn to responsibly use it to light the flame of dissent and activism rather than the destructive potential embedded in that? We can't put the tools back in the bottle. You can't, the old saying, once the toothpaste is out, you can't put it back in the tube. We have to live with the capacity we've given ourselves to take all of this away. But in that comes the moment of potential maturation as well. Every teenager learns this. I can do a lot of damage. That's the moment where you're like in your power as a young person, like I can actually do a lot of damage to the world and myself. But learning to live with that capacity and use it for positive purposes is very hopeful. The vast majority of us do make that leap. We come upon that knowledge. Collectively, the same is possible as well. And then there's thanktivism. Sometimes just looking around and having a little moment of a gratitude check. Being appreciative of the people that you're in community with, the people you're in struggle with, the community. Thank you for honoring all of us. I mean, that's the idea, right? That we don't always take moments to do that. Just even if they're small. They don't have to be uncomfortably awkward, let's all bow to each other now and, do some kind of thing. I mean, it doesn't have to be formalized, but just taking a moment to acknowledge the hard work that people do and that we really appreciate each other. In fact, we could even say that we love each other. And it's okay to do that sometimes, Maybe part of our task as activists and avoiding to be burnt out and renewing ourselves is to become re-enchanted with the world around us and re-enchanted with each other and ourselves in the process. Maybe reflecting on the fact that there's actually more good than bad in the world. The news wants to tell us something different. You're not going to see a headline, Q on a website or in a print newspaper laying out all the good things that happened in the world that day. You're not going to open the paper and say, peace breaks out. Woohoo! It doesn't go like that, right? The reason that the negative tends to dominate our psyche is because, in fact, it's actually an interruption in the normal flow of things. How many days do you go about your business where you hurt somebody? You physically confront somebody, You do something intentionally malicious. Probably not all that many. That's true for the vast majority of people on this planet. The norm is actually that there's more good than bad in the world. Bad holds a lot of sway, and bad has its own 24-hour news channels. But we don't need that, because we know that there's actually more people doing good and more capacity for good. It just doesn't get talked about as much. And then, finally, maybe reflecting on the fact that having the challenges before us are a blessing in some ways. I would be more worried about us individually and collectively if we didn't appreciate the fact that we have challenges in our midst. If I had to come here and tell you, people, wake up, the world is in crisis, get yourselves going, if that was the beginning of this conversation, we'd be so far away from being able to do anything about it. In some ways, the fact that we have the challenges, that the crises are palpable, you don't have to stretch that far to find one. It's all around us. It's in the food we're eating, it's in the room we're sitting in, it's the money that flows through our coffers and our wallets every day. That crisis is embedded in the day-to-day business of our lives. And that can be a blessing, because we're halfway there to the conversation. If we couldn't isolate the nature of the problem, we'd be one big step removed. We know the problem. Now we're having the conversation about what to do about it. So we're halfway there, actually. It's not so bad. And then finally, the ultimate kind of wrapper here is moving from reactivism to proactivism. Can we sometimes suspend our disbelief and seek to create the alternative world that we would like to live in, rather than always thinking about it in terms of how to ameliorate the issues before us? Can we actually create and model what the alternative would look like? Now, if we can do that, right? If we can invent new ways of being in the world, new processes, we can build that future. If we can even have glimpses of that, moments where we do that, that gives us a pretty good vision to set our minds on. Then we can come back and look at the world as it's presently wired, and we can see the reality before us. But then we have this glimpse, this picture maybe it's just a hesitant thing, we've experienced it for a short time, but we have a little bit of that vision that we're aiming for, then it becomes an equation. A equals where we are now, C equals where we'd like to go, and B is the connective tissue. It's the actions we're going to take to move from A to C. It's not that complicated, actually, you know, but part of it is complicated. It's the part where we have to be present enough to suspend our disbelief and say, you know, sometimes the game seems rigged, but there's still a lot of room here. If we can imagine a better world, then we can create it. It's, you know, it's as simple as that. If we couldn't imagine it, again, we'd be in a worse place. If, you know, we couldn't even get to that place where we can see it in our mind's eye, you know, that's not so great, because then it's like, well, what are we even aiming toward? But if we can do it, and we can have glimpses, backyard gardens, and community meeting spaces, and moments where we get to share our stories with each other, building, you know, bonds of solidarity, that's powerful. And being proactive can be a really important way to ease some of the impact of feeling like we're constantly being ineffective, that we're always responding to crisis. This gives us a chance to be proactive in putting our vision out there. And lo and behold, when we do that, it often becomes infectious. Others begin to pick up on it. They see the positive example. They want to compare notes. They ask for us to come and do a, you know, a little speaking tour where we share what worked. I mean, it can, you know, positive can turn into positive. We can get that feedback loop working in a good way rather than in a negative way. So, let me change the nature of how I get at this a little bit. And once I get through these slides, you know, I'm kind of learning this as we do it. It's fun to do it in real time, and I appreciate you letting me have some space to do that. These are things that I often think about, but I don't often speak about. It's not the standard, you know, talk that I would give on radical empathy. I didn't have that. I was actually cobbling together things I've been thinking about for the last few years. But it turns out that there are some real cutting-edge theories of human biology and human science that are suggesting our capacities to do exactly the kinds of positive turning that I'm describing here. One is a notion called mirror neurons. How many folks have heard of mirror neurons before? One. And that's because I told you about it. No. Pancho told us both about it. So a couple of folks, right? So mirror neurons. This is like, you know, the cutting edge of neuroscience here. Here's the idea. It's sometimes expressed anecdotally. Peace Pilgrim has a great quote. She said, "The world is rather like a mirror. If you smile at it, it smiles at you." And that sounds pretty innocent. It isn't that sweet. You know, it's very nice, Peace Pilgrim, you know. But we have other colloquial ways of saying it. Laughter is contagious. Right? You've heard this one before. Sometimes somebody in a room will sneeze and suddenly 3 other people will sneeze. There's ways that we're actually wired to emulate responses, to have our responses emulate behaviors that are displayed to us. So the simple act of observing an other's behavior conditions an autonomic response in us to emulate that behavior. This isn't just, you know, anecdotal. I'm not going to pretend to be a neuroscientist. I can't give you the specific biological underpinnings, but, you know, look it up and do some research on your own. This is meant to just kind of spark your imagination. I'm invoking these scientific slides as talking points and points to potentially inspire a conversation. But I get the idea of what they're saying here, that there's a great empathetic potential. When we observe, or we maybe contribute to creating positive responses on the behalf of others, it comes back to us and triggers similar feelings in ourselves. Conversely, if there are negative things going on and we're contributing to negative outcomes, that comes back on us too. It's kind of the neuroscience of karma, in a way. You know, the do unto others, that if we are putting it out there in a positive way, it is likely to come right back to us on an autonomic level. We may not even be aware of it. It doesn't mean it maps one-to-one, that everything that happens automatically occurs back in us. It's not a precise mirror, but it stimulates empathetic responses at the neurological level. So it gives us a deeper understanding of the plight of the other. We are actually in the other's shoes. It's not just an expression. There's a part of us that's in everyone else around us. If something good is happening and we're helping somebody else, you know, to be what they can be in the world, that actually stimulates a positive response back in us. So the quote from Ramachandran is that the neural basis of it's the neural basis of the reciprocity of self-awareness and other awareness. We are always aware of the other, and the attitudes and abilities and potentials of the other are actually part of ourselves. Whether we process it consciously or not, it's happening on a neurological level. So that's neuroscience's contribution to empathy. Here's genetic research's contribution, something called epigenetics. Has anybody heard of this one? A couple of hands in the room. So again, another one to look up and do some homework on. There will be a quiz at the end of this talk. So epigenetics. Epi meaning external, like epidermis, the thing you're wearing on the outside. Epigenetics says that there are non-genetic factors that can cause an organism's genes to behave differently. External stimuli affect the development of our genetics. Now that seems to be like, is that science really? Because we learn that it's more like a code gets read out, and then certain potentials are created, and then each of us, kind of fills that container and lives to those potentials. But it's actually the external stimuli that help determine which of the potentials we will reach. Our genetic code is like a floor, not a ceiling. It gives us a basis from the individual to spring forth, but it's not a determination of who we will be. The cultural influences, the external influences, both good and bad. The way this is usually studied is around people who have suffered a trauma. And then when the researchers go back to look at the succeeding generations, maybe it's a great famine or a big war or some isolated event where people have experienced a collective trauma, when they go back and look at succeeding generations, they find similar kinds of genetic responses, genetic outcomes that are too prevalent to be explained by random chance. In other words, the trauma is passed from the generation that experienced it to their children, and then their children's children, and even further down the line. Historical wounds have an intergenerational capacity to them. It's kind of startling, actually. Some theories speculate that it's partly held by the environment itself, both literally and figuratively, that the places where people live bear some of the memory, both in terms of toxicity after a war, but also maybe something more transcendent than that. But at the genetic level, the idea is that when a child is in the womb, it's exposed to the trauma that's then filtered by the parent, right? It's filtered. It's not like a direct perception, but it expresses itself in the genetic outcomes of the child. It's not just in utero, too. Some of these studies suggest that it continues even in our early childhood years as we're in that very impressionable, formative time in our lives. The external stimuli affect the genetic and physical outcomes of people. That's a pretty remarkable insight. And again, I'm not a geneticist. I can't tell you I understand the science of it. I'm just a layperson interpreting it. But I see here the capacity for thinking much more transgenerationally, much more intergenerationally. And again, the crisis is an opportunity because if a trauma can be passed from generation to generation, so too can positive outcomes. If we turn this needle just a little bit toward the positive, that will start having a ripple effect and paying more dividends. Good thoughts and actions get emulated by others around us. That creates a deeper sense of well-being at the personal and community, maybe even global level. The children that are coming after those generations experiencing that, they get that by osmosis. It becomes part of their DNA. They wake up and they expect to look at the world as a glass half full rather than half empty. You can see the effect. We're not so far off. We have the mechanisms in place. We just need to change the input a little bit. Move from this kind of repetitive trauma, repetitive tragedy mode that we're in, and turn it into, more of the positive outcome. Change the input, and the spiral, same conditions that create a kind of, feedback loop of despair and futility can easily be turned on their head toward the opposite purpose. And then finally, my last heavy science slide. So we had neuroscience, we have genetics, and now we have consciousness. Cutting-edge theories of consciousness. Has anyone ever heard of the quantum Zeno effect? I knew that one would get no hands. The only reason I ever heard about it is because my youngest son's name is Zeno. So when we looked up his name, after we named him, this came up. I'm like, that's pretty crazy. What is that all about? It's the physics of consciousness, the connection between thought and reality. Now, many of us who have a contemplative practice in our lives already know this. In fact, I think colloquially we all get this. How many times have you had this happen where you hear something for the first time, or you're thinking about something and then it comes up like 3 times in a row? Like, we do tend to create the reality around us. The power of our thoughts cannot be understated, cannot be overstated. Well, either way, actually. we do tend to project a lot of energy out. We just don't always feel like that's a valid way of looking at things. There's so much noise. There's so many thoughts circulating. Life's needs are much more immediate. We're often brought down to the basic, more coping and the physical parts of our lives. We forget this piece of the puzzle, that we actually have the capacity to influence reality by thinking about it. The way this gets expressed through the quantum Zeno effect is that things come into being when people fix their gaze upon it. So, we don't find the electron until we use our measuring device to ask reality to collapse to a point that can be measurable as an electron. We find it when we look for it to some extent. If we don't engage something around us, it tends to lose its integrity. There's actually theories that suggest that it's our observation of the universe that makes it real in the first place. It's our gaze upon it, the frequent gaze, the frequent measurement that prevents things from winking out or decaying altogether. I know it sounds a little mind-boggling, but the reality is, both the indigenous cosmology and quantum mechanics suggest that everything is kind of an assemblage of probability patterns. Little small pieces all swirling around and vibrations. They crystallize in coherent moments like myself and all of you and the objects around us, but that's more the tip of the iceberg. That's illusory to some extent. A deeper reality is that these things are actually not so different than the thoughts that emanate from our heads. In fact, the thought may be the reality in and of itself. So I don't want to go too far down this road because it starts to get a little loose in the way of describing it. And I'm no expert in it, although I did study physics at one point, but they didn't teach us this. I'll tell you that. If they did, I'd probably still be studying physics right now because I like this kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, we start to learn that we are both the dreamer and the dream, the thinker and the one experiencing the reality around us. It's just another expression of deep empathy, that we are so coupled with our environment, ourselves, the bodies we're wearing, each other, and the larger environment. We're so coupled with it that we are in an empathetic relationship, a constant exchange with these things around us. It gives us a lot of power. So here's just a couple of other ways of synthesizing as we move towards some closure here in terms of what I wanted to share with you. And then we'll open it up for some dialogue and exchange so you can help me figure out what these things mean. I see it, as three kind of big levels in our lives. These are all falsities to some extent, self, society, and nature, but yet they're kind of iconic. There are 3 points where the energies really do converge when we think about the world around us. They're not the only 3 points, it's more of a spectrum than isolated places, but nonetheless they do mean something and they're worth looking at from that perspective. First of all, we have the self. So I suggested at the beginning, empathy for the radical. Let's not lose sight of the self. Sometimes there's a way of thinking about the world that suggests we're supposed to transcend the self, or that the self is unimportant. I don't think that that's the case, actually. I think we do matter. There's a reason why the universe wanted to see itself through your eyes, why your life path is unique to you. No one else connects the dots of space and time the way you do. We matter as individuals. That's an important part of the whole. And the care of the self should be part of the way we think about the whole. The same mechanisms we can use to make our own lives work better, healthier food, better relationships, be consuming more consciously, consuming less, being less implicated in structures of oppression. Those are all good strategies for promoting social change as well. So the care of the self is really a big part of it. When sometimes we hear about spiritual paths that include this notion of, kind of transcending or letting go of the self, that's only possible when the self is healthy and doing well. Then you can let it go because it's working well and you can move on to other planes, but you need that self to be actualized. So let's not skip that step. And then care of other. This was a quote from our friend Nipun Mehta, who recently wrote, "When we engage at the cusp of our own evolution, we can't help but broaden from self-orientation to other orientation. We honor our profound interconnection. And as we align with the natural unfolding that is greater than us, we continue to transform ourselves." So care of the other is both an altruistic and a self-interested phenomenon at the same time. I have a deep investment in how well you all are doing because I care about you all, but also because living in a society where people do that as a matter of course feeds back into making all of us prosper as well. I can't be everything I'm supposed to be unless you all are what you're supposed to be. Martin Luther King. It was not a U.S. Army marketing phrase, be all you can be. King said it first, that none of us as individuals can get there to that promised land unless we all get there together. Just by definition, right? Equality is something that has to be equally distributed. I can't be equal and free if you're not. We need to have those things happen at the same time. And then finally, care of the environment, which we were never separate from. It was a moment of great historical amnesia to wake up one day and think that we were somehow not part of the great web of life and all of the constraints and opportunities that that puts before us. We are always embedded in the processes of nature. On a substance level, the resources we need to survive, we're all consumers. We all are in a symbiotic relationship, maybe a parasitic one sometimes it feels like. But what kind of parasite kills the host organism after all, right? Even at that crass level, you would think, well, we should probably think about sustaining the habitat. That seems like a good idea. After all, it does give us everything we need to survive, you know. Again, you don't have to stretch that far. You can make an appeal to self-interest and get people to environmentalism. You don't have to cast it in these kind of, meta-theoretical terms or these big picture or, getting to people's conscience. Even our own self-interest should compel us to think about the other and the larger environment. It's really not that complicated. This stuff has been known forever. It's just the last, few hundred, maybe a couple thousand years we've forgotten some of it, or we've pretended that we forgot it. We made believe because it served certain purposes. But these processes are embedded in the way of things, the neurology of things, right? The genetics of our lives, the consciousness that pervades. There are certain ways that the world is wired. We're part of it. We're lucky to be part of it. It's actually kind of, surprisingly interesting. It gives us a lot of possibility to increase our empathy rather than our separateness and our despair. Here's just another kind of big picture, pulling back slowly kind of point. Just, focusing a little more in our day-to-day lives on solidarity. We talk about it a lot, but we don't always manifest it. We get caught in turf wars and, there's a finite resources and we're competing over them and we have personality conflicts. We've all been there. We're probably there right now, It's part of the way things go. But that's also the magic, too, is that unity isn't something that we all just get along and say, wow, we agree on everything, life is good. That would be super boring. And I would rebel against that kind of utopia where all the challenges were fixed and everything was great. It's about unity in diversity. It's those two things existing at the same time. We need the conflicts. We need the challenges. Seeing that as an opportunity for solidarity is part of our task. Not to eradicate conflict and difference, to celebrate it, promote it, and then use it as a driver for greater forms of solidarity. So that solidarity isn't just a superficial thing. It's actually key. It's the part of diversity that shows itself when we appreciate how different we are and how we're looking at things from different perspectives. Our work is complementary as much as it's in opposition with each other, and forming those kinds of bonds becomes a really important way of thinking about the world. Our liberation is bound up with that of every other being on the planet, the big picture of solidarity. Doesn't mean it's all the same. Equality is not sameness. It means everything's accorded its equal place in the great web of life and the reality that we're creating. So diversity is still in there, but yet they're all interconnected in a non-superficial way. And then the ethic of care, which has gone through many different incarnations. Nell Noddings and Carol Gilligan and many others have reflected on this. The idea is that all individuals are interdependent. Here's the Martin Luther King quote. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. So we are connected that way. It's a basic proposition. It's been understood by pretty much every culture that's existed on the planet, save the one we're living in now. We get it, so it's part of our task to bring that message in and of itself, interbeing, interconnectedness in a non-superficial way. That one concept by itself could change the whole nature of the world that we're living in. And the other part of the ethic of care is that those who are in particular vulnerable to the choices we make deserve extra consideration. So we do know that we're not all equal, freely competing subjects, and there's some objective standard, and the cream rises, and what's the opposite of cream? I don't even know, but it falls behind, right? We have this mythology, the American dream idea. As long as there's fair and neutral standards and everyone competes equally, the good shall win, and the not so good shall be, in the other side of the equation. But that's not true. We know that we're not starting from the same places, we're not gifted with the same tools and privileges, we're not afforded the same opportunities in terms of education and healthcare, etc. We know that many of us enjoy great privilege. In fact, everyone in this room, vis-a-vis most of the people on the planet, enjoy great privilege. So that means that when we're making choices and others who are potentially more vulnerable are exposed to the consequences of those choices, they deserve extra consideration. A little bit of extra attention put on that moment where we might be, even inadvertently, because we're good people, but we're living in this world, sometimes create challenging outcomes for people we may not even meet or know. And then finally, paying attention to the context in which we act, never separating our actions out from a larger context. There's nothing that happens in isolation. There's no action that you can take that's just like, well, I did it in that moment and it was unrelated to anything else and that's what the situation called for. That, feels right sometimes, but enlarging the context to include the unforeseen consequences, the vulnerability of others, the specific interests of the people involved. And this includes, by the way, this is where it gets really hard. This has all been challenging, but this includes the other side as well. The adversary, the 1%, whatever name we want to give them, right? Our empathy has to extend there. Doesn't mean we agree, doesn't mean we don't still interrupt oppression and confront injustice. We do all of that. Sometimes that's an expression of empathy too, to help save the oppressor from being an oppressor. We're trying to liberate them too. We're not going to get there if we're only working on those of us who already agree or the ones who are of like mind. This concept, if it means anything, has to extend past those kinds of boundaries. And it is so hard. It's the hardest thing in the world to do. Not only to care for ourselves, to care for the others in our community that we enjoy affinity with, and then the environment, but oh, by the way, the other side. The ones who speak the language of racism or oppression or economic injustice or warfare, they have to be included in this too. I didn't write this stuff. This is how the world is, right? I mean, history teaches us this. Every single, movement has eventually come upon this moment where you can't just liberate ourselves at the expense of the other. If we do that, we're just replicating the same perverse logic that we claim the other side is doing to us. So this is a real challenge. It's not for the faint of heart, but we didn't become activists because we had faint hearts. We did it because we care about the world around us. And at the end of the day, there's some very basic tools that we are all given. The capacity to love is one of them. I know it sounds a little corny to say it. I'm not going to sing the lyrics, but you know what I'm talking about. In some ways, this really is all we need, is to reclaim that capacity to love this world. Love everything in it. Love each other. I can say that I love you, all of you, and I mean that, seriously. I don't know you all. If I got to know you, I might not be able to say it, actually. But I don't know you all that well, so I can just sit here and say it, and who's really going to check, right? But you know what I'm saying. Like, we do have to reclaim that emotional connection to the people and things around us. There is no object separate from ourselves. There's no other separate from ourselves. We've got to wrap our capacities for compassion, empathy, and indeed love around the larger picture. And so this is a quote from Chris Hedges. Again, I'm just pulling things like in real time. There are many great statements about love, but Chris Hedges is deploying it politically, saying to survive as a human being is possible only through love. We need to recognize love in the lives of others, even those with whom we are in conflict. Love has the power both to resist in our nature what we know we must resist, and to affirm what we know we must affirm. So it's a pretty powerful tool, and it's one that I think we could be a little better, a little more comfortable utilizing. We don't have to feel somewhat awkward about it, or it's like a shameful thing, or it makes us vulnerable. It's part of how we can express our connection, the reason why we do stuff. Sometimes we're really good at knowing how to act and organize something. We might even know what we're doing. We don't always think about the why as much, the bigger picture. What's the reason behind what we're doing this for? That can actually get us through a lot of the kinds of burnout and despair issues that I identified in the beginning. So here's a few questions for the present and or future. Just some things to take away and think about as you move back into the work spheres of your own lives. Can we emphasize self-care, care of the other, and care of the environment in our daily lives and work? Can we bring that front and center and make that the why part, the capacity to think at those three levels? Can we weave that into the day-to-day operations of our lives? What are the new challenges that will arise as conditions likely worsen around the globe? I'm not going to stand here and tell you that things are going to be fixed overnight. I already said it took a long time to get this way. It's going to take a while to undo it. So we're likely to see things get worse before they get better. But if you take the view that conflict is an important driver of resolution, that crisis is an important driver of opportunity, maybe we need to rethink how we relate to that. It's not more despair, it's more opportunity to increase solidarity and empathy in our lives. So there's that. What are the new opportunities that will arise? So this is the flip side, that every one of these worsening issues is an opportunity. Here's just a quick example. I did this at a conference last weekend in Boulder. It was on the ecological sphere of peace. And I did a keynote, but I broke people into smaller groups. This is a smaller setting than this. And I broke people into small groups, and I asked them to think about one particular question. You wake up tomorrow morning, and wherever you buy food from, it's all gone. There's no more food for sale. What do you do? And of course, at first people are like, well, there's no food. You mean I can't buy it anywhere? Is there a black market? There's got to be food for sale. There's no more food for sale. That's my, my challenge. And people talk about it, and then we come back together and they share examples of what they came up with. And they come up with a lot of really great ideas. Let's get together and pool the canned goods that we have in our cupboards and our, our own kitchens. Let's immediately start looking at any seeds we've got, or people who know how to grow food. And let's start figuring out, make sure we get a crop in the ground. Even if it doesn't pay dividends for 6 months, let's get that part of it going. Let's definitely conserve and cut down on the amount of food that we eat. Start thinking about really getting closer to eating at the level of need rather than the level of desire. And on and on. They come up with all these great examples. And then at the end of the exercise, I say, these are great ideas. Why aren't we doing them right now? Why are we waiting for the crisis to emerge when the supermarket's closed? Why aren't we putting all these things into practice? If they're good ideas anyway, and they make a healthier world and healthier people, this is an opportunity. So even a moment of profound crisis becomes a chance for people to get together and share the things in their surroundings and learn how to be in a better relationship with themselves and the world around them. Can we become re-enchanted with the world? There are lots of ways to get there. Music, right? Art, community, food, so many different ways to kind of fall back in love. It's like, I think about it historically, that maybe 500 or 5,000 years ago, humans broke up with the Earth for a while, thinking we're going to see other planets or something. It's not going to happen. We're in a relatively closed system. We need to understand that. The capacity for life to exist is a thin margin, We can't be fast and loose with it. Maybe it's time to come back and, reacquaint ourselves with this life-bearing place that we are part of, that we are in a relationship with. And then finally, can we turn our traumas into opportunities for healing? So can we move from being reactivists to proactivists? From being people who feel a sense of futility to ones who look at the world as a place of opportunity. So that's what I wanted to share with you. And thank you so much for giving me space to do that. I really appreciate it. We do have some time for questions and follow-up, and I'm open to wherever you want to take it. So, does anybody have a thought? Yes, sir.
Can I try something?
Yes.
Because I've been resonating so much with what you're saying. It's like literally vibrations, or I'm getting excited about it.
I feel that way when you play music, my friend.
Well, it's like music to my ears.
Thank you.
So, like kind of an experiential, metaphorical experiment. Can we try something?
Yes, let's do it.
Okay, because we all vibrate at different frequencies, and sometimes we feel like dissonance. With each different people have certain kind of dissonances, but then other people come in and they create harmony. But to kind of experience dissonance in its beauty and harmony at the same time, I'd like to see what happens if we all just let a note come out of us. And it would be like a 40-note chord. And so to hear the dissonance and the harmony at the same time, and just feel it, and feel the way we're resonating with each other. Would that be okay?
Let's do it, yeah.
Okay, so here we go.
Nice, the lingering bass line. Beautiful,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you, Jonathan, I appreciate that. Yes.
Hello. as a long-time activist, I've beaten myself up in all the ways you described.
I had you in mind when I was doing the slides, actually.
But you know, what I've realized over the years is, first of all, some things I'm better at and other things I'm not better at. And so over the years I've come to accept you know, what I'm not good at or as good as other people. And the other things that I like certain things and don't like certain things, and with regard to activism and so forth. And so, like, you know, one of my strange pathologies, for example, is that I just hate the telephone. And so I kind of exempt myself from that part of activism that involves the telephone, you know, and kind of do other things. And also, this changes over the life course. So I was testifying down in the legislature in the mid-1980s, and as a result of that, I made a vow to myself that I would never go near that goddamn place. I thought they were real idiots. I kept that vow for a long time, you know, but a couple of years ago, an issue brought me back, and I didn't feel nearly as negative, despite the fact that the quality and intelligence of the legislature went down. But, you know, so and that made me realize, well, you know, maybe I was like 40-something then, and then I was 60-something, you know, and so my life changed a little bit, and I was willing to play a part that seemed so distasteful to me at an earlier point.
So the maturation process continues, right? It's not just in our teen years or something. We're constantly evolving. Part of self-care, part of having empathy for ourselves, and part of being of service to others is recognizing our own needs and our own limitations, the things that we tend to be good at. You know, sometimes we have this illusion that, well, I can do it all, but that can be a recipe for burnout too. And frankly, that's not such a good community building strategy. It's good to exist in a space where, you know, maybe we could all participate in certain kinds of activities because we all have the capacity to, you know, think or speak, whatever. But at the end of the day, some of us will be more inclined towards certain types of tasks. In a healthy society, that would be well distributed, and none of those pursuits would be able to exert power and influence over the others, right? They would all be equally viable. So if, you know, you're a food grower and you're a legislative lobbyist or whatever, those are two equally viable strategies, and in a healthy community or a healthy social movement, they would be accorded the same, you know, same weight. So really being open to that evolutionary path, I think, is important. I've seen that in myself. I was a lawyer at one point in my life and abandoned it altogether and didn't want to go into a courtroom at all until it became necessary to do so. And I found that I could actually make use of it and make some decent social change. Aside from the legal case, just the symbolism and the utility of that forum became something that I was willing to wade back into. So very similar kind of outcome. Yes?
I wanted to say first, I really appreciate the healing capacity of what you're saying. But I also wanted to ask you a question of something that I struggle with, which is the ways that we're complicit in oppression through privilege, through things that are not intentional. And how, when we're being empathetic, can we include ourselves knowing that we, in many ways, are the aggressors?
Absolutely. I mean, we can't disentangle ourselves from the structures of oppression in which we exist, right? We can have all the moral evolution we want in our lives, but we still have to eat. And in this culture, that means something. It's not easy to procure the things we need to survive. We have a situation where, you know, our capacity to sustain ourselves is pitted against the long-term sustainability of the planet and our society. You know, where our ethics and, you know, the things we need to survive, it's challenging. It is. To disentangle that is very complex. You know, I struggle with this myself all the time because there were times in my life when I thought I could break completely out of that mode. You can't. It's a duality. We're in that cycle. I guess for me, I come to a place where I see it as it's a profound opportunity, actually. If it's the case that we contribute and we're complicit in the structures that oppress us, that's also a point of potential power, an entry point into those structures where we can, through every single action we take, change the nature of them at the same time. We don't just have to buy it. We're pushing something back. You know, that's one of the possibilities in this globally interconnected age, is that everything that happens to you is also an entry point to poke back up into the hole. Now the hole is linked in a profound way. Sometimes it's terrifying. It's very top-down. It's very technocratic. It makes us the agents of our own oppression. But I think in that moment, each act can also become one of liberation if we do the hard work of owning those moments. So it's challenging. I hear you, and I think I saw a lot of heads nodding when you were putting that point out there, for sure. Let's go in the back, yes.
Okay, in my experience, I noticed you have a word out there, co-opted, and I just want a brief comment or opinion. I've noticed that a larger group can co-opt a smaller group in the U.S., especially minority groups. And if that larger group dominates the political parties, they do seem to dominate the smaller group because of the influence they have. I wonder what your opinion is of that, because in my opinion, I can see that you do belong to the larger group of the U.S. from what I see. I wonder what your opinion is.
Well, I'm kind of suspicious of when scale gets beyond the capacity for humans to still be part of it. So when you're talking about large groups like political parties, no doubt they have a co-optive tendency. I mean, you can see the Democratic Party constantly sniffing around the edges of Occupy. They want Occupy to be their Tea Party, like under the umbrella, kind of a feeder into their electoral success, but not an autonomous anti-party movement that could actually threaten the seat of power that's currently enjoyed, right? So there's a lot of those kinds of pressures. I think keeping the scale somewhat real. You know, humans, we can't hang out with 7 billion people. You can't do it. It's just too vast. The larger the scale goes, the more likely some of these things are to go haywire. I think when we're grounded in local autonomy, when we can look around and see in a room of 50 or 100 people the beginnings of a capacity to have a healthy community, when we know where our food comes from, when we kind of know the allies we're working with, if that's the base of our lives, then I don't fear the co-optation from above quite so much, because their power is greatly diminished. It's only when we don't have a foothold wherever we are, living in concert with each other, that we become more vulnerable to being gobbled up by larger interests out there. So I would say to me, the hedge against what you're describing is more deeply rooted local autonomy. Yes?
First of all, I'm Shannon Rivers. I'm Akhmir Autumn. I'm from Gila River. And I go to a lot of activism seminars and discussions. And my people have been here for a long time. And in the 1600s, Father Keynote came through, and the first thing our warriors did was run out to him and said, "You can't come any further, because we don't know who you are, and we heard stories about you." And those stories were the destruction of everything you just talked about. I guess I have a couple of questions, but to say that there was harmony before non-Indian people came here is somewhat, it's not going to be true. There was battles between our Apaches and our Navajos, but very rare. It was a very rare thing. But none of us destroyed the society as it is now. And I feel that I have this PTSD from all my long-term oppression since the 1600s. And it feels good to hear everybody listen to this, but I worry about my white brother who talks this way and doesn't really make the change. Because the reality is that indigenous peoples continue to be oppressed in this country, and you heard that earlier. With assert action as the only avenue we got. But, there's not this ecological innocence that we came from. We're always struggling to try to help our brother recognize this. So I always feel on the defense. I feel the burning. I feel the struggle. Because I see that struggle within my own people every day. And all of you that live here, if you go through Salt River or Gila River, those are reservations. We are the only country that has those, really, besides Canada, maybe places in Central and South America. But I struggle because I love the discussion, but I hate to go home and know that nothing's hardly ever happens. And by that I mean I see you on the street, and we're going through the same system we've always been doing. Indian people try to get gaming facilities that don't help. For long-term poverty, how do we handle stuff like that? I guess my question to you is, with this long-term oppression, this long-term defense that I have, how do you, this is great for somebody who steps into activism. I didn't step into it. I was born into it, 1600s and on. And it's a struggle. How do you, as you go on the reservation, you see that oppression. You see that despair. And Indian people don't smile too much. because they feel that weight of that burden. I'm not saying all Indian people, but if you know indigenous people and they're struggling, how do you handle something that is long-term? And that's not a psychological problem. It is a spiritual problem. It is spiritual oppression from these people, from you, our relatives, who we try to struggle to live next to.
Thank you for that. I don't want to give you a glib response because I can't wipe the stain of history clean just with my words, and I don't even want to try to do that. I think we all understand the reality of where we are right now and where we're living, that, to some extent, many of us enjoy the privileges of the historical baggage of slavery and genocide that have not been atoned for in any way, shape, or form. We have not done any kind of healing or reconciliation around these issues in the United States at all. And it's a crime of historical proportions. I think many of us feel it. Those of us here in Arizona in particular who are activists are probably slightly more in tune to it than some folks elsewhere are, because we're living, you can't deny it, the land is here, you can feel it wherever you go. So, I don't have an easy answer to that. I think some of it, that what I was talking about with the intergenerational nature of trauma, there may be something to that in what you're describing, that it's very hard to break that kind of cycle. But it's not impossible to do so. I think you're right. If this is just a good conversation here today, then that's great for what it is. Maybe it makes us all feel a little better. I feel like I did a good job and I gave you something to think about and I get to put a line on my CV. That's not going to cut it. That is not going to cut it. We have a lot of baggage to deal with. And part of the task is we have to roll up our sleeves and do it. I think you're right. The time for talking about it is well past. This is the moment. I had on one of the slides there, is there any other time you'd rather be alive than now? And I mean that sincerely, like this is the crossroads. You all feel that to some degree, right? I think people have felt that a lot of times throughout history, but we're here now, and the signs are pretty clear that the totality of these issues, these chickens are coming home to roost. Like, there's no there. We can't outsource our waste, both the mental pollution and the physical pollution. There's no there. You can't put it someplace else. We have to own this stuff now, and that includes the baggage of history. So again, I don't want to try to give you a glib response. I thank you for bringing that out so that that's in our consciousness as we leave this space and go back to do the work that we're called to do in the world. Who else? Yes.
It's kind of just highlighted for me. Watching the panel earlier is very related but very discreet activists, people working on workers' rights for largely poor minority people and the protecting the peaks. There's these very discrete issues, and your question, sir, really highlighted it, because that's something. If your full life, you every day are dedicated to a cause, and of so many other causes that are just as worthy, or some that are even more of a historical portion, how do you deal with the feeling like, okay, I'm doing my part here, but then I'm not doing my part in so many other ways?
Well, you can't do everything, right? I mean, we still are individuals. You can't do everything. You can do the things you're good at. You can find the places where you resonate, literally and metaphorically. Like, find those points where you feel like you're in tune with what's going on around you. Those are pretty good guideposts. Listening to that. For me, it's the kind of thing where I tend to look at it and realize that every small issue is actually connected to the whole. We could see that even in this panel, which was just snapshots. Even though people may not have had dialogues with each other, there was a shared vocabulary, there was moments of cross-pollination. Even the individuals up here at the table had, referred back to each other, said, back in the day I actually worked with a group that did the kind of thing you're doing. So there is that cross-pollination, but, not always feeling like we have to fix everything. Sometimes it's really just doing the things that are around you in terms of your skills, your predisposition, and the opportunities before you, with the knowledge. In a globally connected world, which it always was, but now it's demonstrably so, every single action does get back in and impact that whole. There's no non-essential work to be done. Wherever there's a crisis, there should be somebody there trying to turn it into an opportunity and feeling good about that. Some folks are really, really dedicated around something concrete and specific, and that's their life's work. I'm kind of envious of those people sometimes, because I tend to get pulled to the next thing and the next thing and always be thinking about the other 10 issues I'm not working on when I'm working on one. That's the tape in my head going, you know? But I also know that there's certain skills I can bring to the table and other things I can't do, and I'm okay with that too, you know? It's taken me a while to get there. So I think just, you know, roll up your sleeves and dig in wherever you are and feel like that's worthy at that moment. And, you know, that's okay. It's okay to give ourselves that. To be like, I can just focus on this one thing, knowing that it is impacting all the rest because the bonds are there whether we sit down and acknowledge it or not. Yes?
You said you think that now is the time to act, not time to talk anymore. What do you think about Chris Hedges saying that Black Bloc is the cancer of the Occupy movement?
Well, I actually wrote a response to him. You can go look it up online. I called it a bustle and Hedges' row. I was tweaking him a little bit. I know Chris a little, and I challenged him after that article came out. I think that's a large conversation, and it's one that would probably take us in some different directions, but fundamentally what I argued in response was that I thought he made a grave mistake, both metaphysically and tactically, to do that publicly. Like, we don't need to be dividing off and separating out. If, you know, Occupy or any movement that we're in is to mean something, it should be about using the processes to bring people together. Yes, there are going to be disagreements about tactics and strategies. We have to talk about that. The idea that somehow we're going to take a segment of people, you know, back a few months ago it was the homeless that were bringing down Occupy, right? Then suddenly it's the Black Bloc bringing down Occupy. I wrote a piece back in November called Welcome Home, saying if we're going to have a movement that reflects the 99%, invite people into these conversations. We're working on consensus decision making. We're trying to relearn democratic processes. This isn't the time to excise people out because they're difficult or present challenges. Those challenges are opportunities in disguise. Let's sit down and talk about it. If the fact that youth feel a sense of urgency where they want to act out in a more visceral way, I don't think there's any of us who are a little bit older who can't understand that, you know? We can have that moment where we put it all on the table, but it does take both sides to do it. So the door of conversation needs to be open from the perspective of folks who use more confrontational tactics and people who use more traditional, you know, whatever form we want to call it. But I definitely don't agree with the notion of separating out, cutting off, making people more vulnerable. It needs to be a conversation and not just a close the door kind of approach. So anyway, you can read what I wrote in response to Hedges and drop me a line and let me know what you think. Yes?
So I'm a recovering blackboard. So, you know, one of my major issues is the death penalty. And, you know, I go down and join vigils before an execution almost every time. And I don't believe I'm going to go down to the Senate lawn and stand there and abolish the death penalty. But what I am going to do is sort of temper where my personal victory is going to be as an activist. And for me, it's making sure that at least, if nothing else, I say, someone's going to get executed tonight. And I really want to say, not in my name. Because every time it happens, and if I stay home and I'm eating Cheerios and somebody's getting executed that night, then in a way I'm sort of complicit in what's going on. So I think it's important for movements, for activists, to sort of understand what they're going to determine to be victory. Because for activists, victory is always kind of elusive.
That's right. And sometimes it feels like our victories are few and far between, and even when we win, like in the Peaks case, there was a moment in time where they won that case. And then it gets spun up, you know, the other side just litigates you forever and ever until they get a decision that they want. So victories are hard to come by in the final sense of the word. I think part of the way of dealing with our complicity is precisely to sometimes publicly remove our cooperation, you know, even if it's symbolic, even if it's bearing witness only. It's a way at least of being present for that moment where we get to say, this is not being done in my name. You can say it's being done by society or the state or some other, you know, entity out there, but we have the right to remove our cooperation from that. In fact, that's one of the most powerful strategies of, you know, of nonviolent resistance, is precisely to remove our cooperation, to not give our consent to have things happen in our name. Sometimes it's symbolic, sometimes it's more tangible, but it certainly makes a difference. And I think we've all been in those moments where you could easily change the channel and pour another glass of wine or something, you know, and instead you go out there and you stand on that lawn. And maybe next time there's 2 other people that come out, and 2 others, and 2 others. You have to try, at least for the symbolic gesture of saying that I don't agree with this. So I don't discount that. If you believe in the connection between thought and reality, I think it's important for us to own a little bit of that moment. You know, like it's very easy for us to point the finger and say, oh, it's them waging war halfway around the world. It's George Bush and Dick Cheney who invaded Iraq. It's us, right? We paid for it. We didn't turn the paradigm when they went to do that. We didn't make it impossible for them to continue governing under anti-democratic conditions. We kind of gave them a pass. Maybe we were too comfortable, we were too afraid. We didn't want to own that piece of it. It's hard, but we have to kind of own that. And I think what you do to go and make that pilgrimage each time, that's a way of reminding us that we have to own our piece of it. Very powerful. Maybe we have time for one more. I think we should probably wrap up because there's other things coming. Yes, Elizabeth, you get the last question.
Well, one of the things that was just sort of slightly in there was think about visioning. And as I've gone, through activism for 11 plus years now,
Ever since I've known you, really.
Yeah. I start to see the shifts and the flows, and I look at the data and things like that, and you can see trends coming, you can see things coming, but, one of the things that I think keeps me focused and, is sort of like the idea of having a long-term vision, wherein my small units of action or connection with other people can lead to, some sort of dramatic gain based on the circumstances that appear to be, arising. And so I think it's important for people to really feel that, well, struggle takes a long time, but you can make it. You just have to make it. You have to do it. You have to find other people that will do it with you, and cultivate relationships and stuff. But I think having a long-range plan really can help with not feeling as though you're always losing.
Is Marcelino out there?
Yeah, I mean, I often consider myself something like a shameless purveyor of radical hope. Maybe, something like that. Not the hope that's marketed back to us as a slogan to buy something or vote for someone, but in a deep sense of the word, not a false hope. But I honestly do believe that we're going to get this right. I really do. It's just that, we need to think about it sometimes. I need to think about it in a longer term sense, because that overwhelming sense of crisis, like going both backwards into the past and projecting ahead into the future, you can kind of get lost in that and become much more disempowered. When I do my classes, I teach college classes, and when I structure my classes, I often do this kind of yin and yang approach. We spend the first half of the term talking about war or whatever the subject is. I teach peace studies, so we might talk about war for the first half, and then peace for the second half. Because the two are connected. Conflict and resolution, right? There's a nexus between those things, and you need both to keep the circle moving. It's okay to have that, but you need to take a long view of things. And it's challenging because we do care deeply, and we want things to work out quickly, and we know that the crises are mounting and the gravity is increasing. But giving ourselves a little bit of a break, stepping back, saying, no, there's a lot of cause for hope, actually. There are a lot of good things happening in the world. In every moment, there's the capacity to feel something positive, to smile, to express love, to tell a joke, to laugh, to hug someone, to be present for something that, surprises you. There's so many things that happen all the time. I mean, I can't think of a day that hasn't made me feel hopeful. And honestly, I've never met a single human being that I couldn't learn something from. Not once. Maybe even by negative example, right? But you can always learn something from every single person. That's pretty hopeful, I think. And I would like to close just by saying that being with all of you and being able to share with you and dialogue with you a little bit is also one of those sources of hope for me. So I thank you all so much.